Has anybody used EndNote before? No?
No.
Okay. Have you used any other citation like manager before? There's a couple of them out there.
One, but I don't remember.
Cool.
It
No.
was Mrs. B's class.
Okay. So we're going to go over a brief description about EndNote. So it's a citation manager software, like I've already mentioned. It kind of helps you organize and cite specific literature papers, which is really important because when you start doing your reference paper, you're going to have so many different references, and it's kind of helpful to keep track of those, like what you've already read, and then helps when your partners come together, what they've read, and kind of just manage everything. So we've kind of already asked this before. Nobody's used it, so that's cool because this will give a really great tutorial on how to set it up and get started. So like we've kind of already mentioned, it just ensures that you are able to learn how to use it and incorporate it into your research paper. The process, first, you're going to go to this website here. And I'll post this so you'll have all of this information. It's going to pop up with a screen that looks like this. And your first step is, since you're not a member, you're going to go ahead and register using a non-Texas State email. And this is important just so you can access this material later after you graduate, because your Texas State email expires like 6 months after you graduate. And if you ever want to use this research later, you'll be able to have it, which is really important because here at Texas State, you have so many opportunities to be able to access research and materials and stuff like that that you really don't have in the real world. So use it while you can. And then the next step, everybody's going to create an EndNote, but only one person in the group is going to make a group for the group. And I'll go over how to do that actually right now. So to create a group, you're going to go to this Organize tab. You're going to go to Manage My Groups and then create a new group. And then the one person that you've decided within your group is going to do this. And the group name should be each of y'all's last names and then the topic. So an example would be like Chriselle, Wolmuth, and Iron. Okay? Everybody got that?
Yes, ma'am.
Perfect. Alrighty. And then the next step is that one person that created the group is going to invite me to the group. So to do that, you're going to go to Organize, Manage My Groups. And then after you've created your group, it'll come up and then Manage Sharing. And then it's going to give you a place to enter an email. You're going to type in ksw67@texasstate.edu and then go ahead and send that to me. This is how you'll get credit for your references for your paper. All right, do we have any questions so far? Okay. All right, so this is how you add a source. There's a couple different ways you can do it. All of them are going to start with this collect button right here. Okay. And then so you'll see there's online search, new reference, or import reference. So if we're starting with an online search, you'll most likely be using PubMed, but if you have other resources that you like, databases that you like to get your resources from, it'll be a long scroll down menu. You can choose whichever one you like. But if you are using PubMed, use the NLM one. I think it's the only option. It used to not be, but this one will help the best. And then that way you can search through the PubMed database to find your resource.
Hey, Kristen, I have a question.
Yeah.
You know, we can access PubMed from just the internet browser or through the Texas State Library.
Right.
Right. this won't allow them to dig into the Texas State Library, right?
No, but it'll allow them to pull up the resource.
Okay, that's
So,
fine.
yeah, so even if you've already found the article through the Texas State Library, you can pull it up again to easily input it into the EndNote. Okay, does anybody else have questions? All right, then if you want to input using a new resource, a new reference, this is where you just manually input the data yourself. So PubMed, if you are using it through the Texas State website, will have all this information fairly clearly. And you can go ahead and just input it that way. And it'll look like this. And then if you're doing an import reference, so this is if you already have the file on your computer and you want to find it from your computer and input it that way, because PubMed and stuff like that will allow you to download the resource, which is a really smart idea too, just so you have a backup. And so that's if you wanted to import it that way. So there's 3 different ways. And there's just a close-up of that. Alrighty. And then for the assignment that you'll have, everybody's going to do the assignment. You're going to take a screenshot of your own EndNote library and with at least one reference on there. It's just to show that you were able to upload a reference successfully. And then you're going to send a screenshot in of that. It's going to be the file name, it's going to be the EndNote, and then your last name. So literally the screenshot can just look like this as long as you have one reference. Okay, now a little bit of a pop quiz. All right, so does anybody want to tell me what EndNote is?
It's a citation manager.
Perfect. Does anybody want to say why it's important?
To keep your citations organized when you have a lot of them when you're writing a paper.
Awesome. All right. So what will you label your group name? And then how does making a group work?
Last name, topic, and you go to organize, create new group.
Perfect. And then just one of y'all needs to make the group and then invite the other person and invite me.
But we do, each person needs to submit that PDF, that screenshot then, though, because you
Yes.
said that was only one last name.
Yes. So everybody is doing the assignment, but only one person is making the group for the research paper. Okay. Cool. And then lastly, is there anything that you need more clarification on?
No, ma'am, you explained it beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay,
One
well,
more commercial for this. Are you going to talk about how this process generates reference lists?
I can.
Yeah, why don't you, because there's some magic involved in this process. We know it's new, and whenever you learn new technology, it's sometimes intimidating if you haven't tried it, but Kristen's steps are just crystal clear. But there's so much benefit to learning to do this, because not only does it organize your references, but also when you're writing your paper, you have to cite. When you write down facts, you have to indicate what reference it came from. EndNote makes this spectacularly easy and automatically generates your reference list. That's why we want you to keep this file outside of Texas State. So let's say you go to graduate school back here, fine, then you're ready to go. Let's say you go work in private practice, you've still got your references that you gathered. So in other classes and other projects, you continue to use this software. If you go to graduate school at Texas State, we're all using it. So you'll have a leg up and you won't have this bit of information to learn. This is the most productive thing you can do to manage scientific references.
Give me 1 second. Okay. So you'll have to download EndNote for your computer, and you can do that through the Texas State website, the one that's provided in the assignment tab. And then
What she's saying there is in the assignment, and go ahead and start on this right away. In the assignment, Texas State gives lots of support for EndNote. So you can, it bought this software free for you to use. And so it's there for you.
And then once after you've downloaded it, you can download a plugin for Microsoft Word, and it'll show up in the reference tab. Can y'all see my document?
I don't see what else you're doing. We just see that one screen. Are you sharing more than that screen?
Yeah, I tried to. Here, wait. Can you see this empty document?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So under your reference tab, it'll show the EndNote citations, and you'll be able to input it using the EndNote options. So you'll just go to references here, and it'll come up with the EndNotes options. I can post more detailed instructions on how to do that.
Yeah, I think that'd be a great idea. It's nice to have these separated too, so they can get started, and you can make a second video on how to download the plugin and how nice it is to be able to cite using this. That's perfect.
Perfect. Awesome, guys. Does anybody else have any other questions?
All right. Thank you so much, Kristen. And again, we'll post this. I'm going to stop recording. Last class period, we were talking about infant nutrition, and we talked about, this is a little bit of a review. We talked about anthropometric assessments, and we mentioned that there's standard assessments that we make that help us understand how infants are growing, and weight for age is very important. Length is important too, and then it's done recumbently. Head circumference, and then also weight for length. And so we gave some examples of this. Here's a weight for length chart for boys. And then we also talked about newborn size classifications by weight. And this is very important because infants who are very small or very large often have more difficulty thriving. So there is appropriate for gestational age, which using the growth chart is between the 10th and 90th percentile. Small for gestational age is less than the 10th percentile for age. Large is over the 90th percentile for age. Low birth weight here is less than 2,500 grams or 5.8 ounces. And here's very low birth weight. And we talked about how the cause of having very small babies is something called intrauterine growth restriction. There can be a variety of causes for this. They're not always understood. This is one of the reasons why women need prenatal care, so that they get weighed on a monthly basis in the beginning and have their vitals checked. They have, in around 24 to 28 weeks, they'll also do a urine analysis to see if there's any diabetes present, but also looking at weight gain, and they'll do measurements of the infant to see how growth, and to try to troubleshoot. So here's another graph. It's a weight for age for boys. And this, we'll talk about this later when I talk about child obesity. We'll talk about using these growth charts for categorizing kids based on these growth charts. So why do we care about categorizing kids? Well, there are risks associated with low birth weight. And I have this big list here, and I will never ask you an essay question for you to list them all, because there's a lot. I think if you take a really good look, you can see that there are a great many risks that are faced by very low birth weight babies. They're not they're not very big. They may end up being having diabetes, hypertension, irritable bowel syndrome, more likely to die early. You know that premature infants also are likely to die earlier, and so forth. So there's a lot of issues associated with low birth weight. We want to do everything we can to prevent it when we can. And this gets back to prenatal care and basic understanding of good nutrition and exercise for people living in the wild, pretty much. Okay, then what about large babies? About 9% of babies worldwide are born large for gestational age. Some of them are very big. I don't know what the record is. It's 14 to 16 pounds, just some horrid thing, right? Because people like to have 8-pound babies. That seems comfortable and doable. But very large babies oftentimes occur when, and I'll talk about this during pregnancy, but they often occur when mom maybe starts a pregnancy obese and also gains a lot of weight during that and may also have uncontrolled diabetes. So these issues that be associated with her elevated blood sugar can cause excess growth in the infant, and they basically have excess body fat. And so because they're large, they may have trouble being delivered vaginally. So often a surgical delivery happens. This shoulder dystocia occurs when they try to birth a baby and the one shoulder won't come out, okay, because the baby's too big. And so that they often have to like break the clavicle and birth the baby that way and fix them up afterwards. So it complicates things. There's this increased risk for child obesity as well. The low blood sugar we mentioned last time, some infants are at risk for low blood sugar at birth, and this is why if breast milk isn't adequate at that time, then formula is important to help maintain that blood sugar during those first few hours and days of life. And then they have a lifelong increase for metabolic syndrome. Any questions so far? Okay, so this is a difficult thing to talk about, but it's very important to understand what infant mortality rate is, how this reflects on our nation, how this is related to birth weight, and also how not everyone in our country has the same infant mortality rate. So first of all, here's a definition of infant mortality. It is the deaths from birth to age 1 for every 1,000 births within 28 days after birth. Okay. So in other words, infants that die related to the birth, and that is their infant mortality rate. Causes are serious birth defects, and later on sudden infant death syndrome. Some infants die in their beds. This is not understood well. It has to do with breathing for the most part. We know that kids that must be laid on their back to sleep until they can start flipping over. That's been a campaign that's really helped a lot of infants survive. It's thought that when they sleep with their face against pillows or bumper pads or anything like that, they end up breathing in too much carbon dioxide, and that can be contributory. I think I mentioned this, that breastfeeding is beneficial in help protecting this as well. But anyway, these are primary causes. The other one, which we've been focusing on, is low birth weight and preterm births. So babies that have low birth weight or very low birth weight are also more likely to die in the first year of life. Okay, so the United States, the number was 5.7 deaths in 2018. So let's dig into this a little bit more. First, let's look at the connection between birth weight and infant mortality. I like, this is an old chart from the book, and I like it so much because I believe it's very clear. So here we have birth weight in pounds and then in grams. And you notice in a couple of cases, I gave you both information when we were looking for categorization by weight. This is weeks of gestation. So premature infants are born before they're ready, basically. And so these are the premature times, right? And this is the infant mortality rate. So very small babies, the rate out of 1,000 is very high, right? And so as they progress in the pregnancy, and as they progress, the longer they're incubated, basically, the more likely they are to survive. So then you begin to get up into here's 5 pounds 8 ounces, then the number is only 4.6. And then 6 pounds, it's only 2.41. And then look between 7 and 8, it's about 1 to 2 deaths per 1,000. So this is one of the reasons why we support women to grow infants to the best of their ability, right? You can't control many of these things, but we try to support and moderate her weight gain and activity so that she gains a good amount of weight that's commensurate with having a kid that's in this range, because we know it's more helpful for her and also for the infant. And then you can see going past the due date, and sometimes and when the babies get larger, then the infant mortality rate can go back up again. And we don't really have numbers for this. So this lets you know why weight matters so much. Now, let's take a look at this graph. This is the infant mortality rate in the United States compared to other countries. So you take a look here and you can see that our infant mortality rate is higher than other countries. Now, let's take a look at infant mortality rate in the United States by race and ethnicity. And this is where we start to get pieces of the puzzle, okay, and figure out why the United States has more trouble. If you look at different groups here, you can see that among Asian Americans, for example, the infant mortality rate is below the 5.7 we mentioned. And then as you look at other groups, you can see Native Hawaiian, American Indian, Alaska, and non-Hispanic Black. What always strikes me is the differential here of non-Hispanic Blacks compared to the rest of the nation. Remember, it's about 5.7 is the infant mortality rate average around the nation, and non-Hispanic Black children, their infant mortality rate is much higher. So I want to talk about this some. Okay, this brings us to the topic of health disparities and health equity. So the next 2 slides, I'm going to talk about health disparities first, and then health equity to frame this concept. Okay, a health disparity. And this is from healthypeople.gov. If a health option is, if a health outcome is seen to a greater or lesser extent between populations, there's a disparity. So in this case, infant mortality rate is higher in Black Americans. That is a health disparity. There are many health disparities in our country, often related to poverty, but also related specifically to race. And it's important that we acknowledge that. So here's what can be associated with health disparities. I mentioned race, ethnicity. Also, depending on what we're looking at, sex, sexual identity, age, disability, poverty, location in the country, all these things affect people's health. So it's our health outcomes have lots of contributors. During the past 2 decades, the Healthy People, which is an organization, the government puts together Healthy People goals to improve the health of the United States, and they have a variety of focuses or foci. In Healthy People 2000, it was to reduce health disparities among Americans. In 2010, it was to eliminate them. In 2020 was to even get better than that and achieve health equity. Eliminate disparities, improve health for everyone. So remember, what a disparity is when the outcome is seen as to a greater or lesser extent between populations. And our example here is Black infants in the United States compared to the average. Okay, so this next slide, we're going to talk about health equity. Health equity is the attainment of the highest level of health for all. That's our goal. And that means, in this case, the infant mortality rate would be as low as possible, and it would be the same for groups. So there wouldn't be a differential between groups, and that everybody could achieve their potential. It requires valuing everybody equally with focused and ongoing societal efforts to address avoidable inequalities, historical and contemporary injustices, and the elimination of health and healthcare disparities. So I think many of you, at least in my last class, have seen this slide before in some of your other classes. So this is showing what equality is, and this is showing equity. Remember, our goal is equity. Now, equality, the example is here, let's give everybody a bike. Okay, well, that's fine, you know, for transportation. It's not a health outcome, but that's fine. You give everybody a bike, does that work for every person? right? Especially if it's all the same size bike, right? You can see here, this is too little, too big for this guy, this is too small, and it doesn't work for somebody with a disability. So equality is doling out the same thing without taking into consideration the needs of those populations. Some populations need different resources. So equity is when you take the differences between people into account. And so the services that are provided allow everyone to achieve the highest level of health for all. So that is the goal. And at least it's written as a goal in the United States, but in order to have things like this happen, requires lots of effort on the policy level. Like what is access to healthcare? How do we take care of women prenatally? How are we careful that people from different races have everything they need in order to have the best possible level of health? Now, I am not an expert on this area. You do luckily have a faculty member who is, Dr. Cassandra Johnson, teaches the health equity, or she teaches our policy and ethics class, and you'll take that class after this. And she goes into phenomenal detail about these issues, and your education will be rounded. So that's what I'm not done here. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is talk about this a little bit more, because what I have left out so far is what's going on. Why is there a difference between groups? So I have a couple of videos that I want to show you. And since this seems to be working okay in class, I'm going to try it here.
Black women in the U.S. are at a much higher risk of losing their babies, according to a new study. The report, Fighting at Birth, Eradicating the Black-White Infant Mortality Gap, finds the infant mortality rate for Black women is the highest of any ethnic group. Even factors like education, age, and socioeconomic status fail to impact the racial disparity. Keisha Bentley Edwards is a co-author of that report. She's also an assistant professor of general internal medicine at Duke University, and she joins me now from Durham, North Carolina. Keisha, thank you so much for being with us. Can you explain why that infant mortality rates are highest for Black women? I mean, we do know that unfortunately, about 24% of Black women in the U.S. live at the poverty line or below. But this isn't just about poverty, correct?
Correct. That poverty was what people pointed to, especially in the last, I'd say 30 or 40 years, actually even longer than that, as a contributing factor for Black women having higher infant mortality rates. However, as we've had war on poverty initiatives as well as healthcare initiatives, these disparities, although the numbers, the infant mortality rates has decreased, the disparity has stayed the same, and for some groups it's actually widened. And so that's what's causing so much concern. And what's especially sort of disturbing or interesting about this study is that it finds that mothers with doctorates, the highest level of education possible, are more than twice as likely to lose their babies than white women. Why does the rate rise for Black women with higher education levels? Yeah, it's amazing. I was actually surprised that it was that high. I do that the disparity widen as education levels increase for Black women. And really that is a big part of the question. And once you take away age as a factor, you take away marital status as a factor, this gap still remains. And the one thing that you have to look at is racism, both interpersonal and structural racism, as a contributing factor for these disparities, particularly for people who have higher degrees. And it takes a toll on you. There's been research on the weathering effect on Black women. And you also have to say, what is the price on Black women's bodies for being the first in these rooms, when you're the first person in the room, or if you're the only Black woman in the room? What stressors are added when you have to deal with those issues?
Because we should note that among white women, the higher the education level, the lower the infant mortality rate. So it would clearly seem to indicate, as you say, that there is a stressor associated with it. Now, this report also contains policy recommendations. What are some of those?
Well, one of the big issues that we wanted to look at was policies, research, and interventions that focus specifically on Black women. So not just a lot of times these initiatives that are looking to help Black women focus on poverty. However, as our research shows, given educational status, those initiatives that focus on poverty will not reach Black women who are actually vulnerable to adverse birth outcomes. And so we are really pushing for more policies that focus on Black women, as well as having better care for Black women, no matter what their educational status, as far as in maternal care. And the last one is we need to work on discrimination that occurs before, during, and after pregnancy. And so really reinforcing organizations that fight racism in the workplace, in social settings, and just overall. And we're really calling on allies to back up Black women when we see things aren't going well or that people are being mistreated.
But looking back to sort of policy proposals, how have doctors and lawmakers reacted to previous policy proposals suggesting that doctors focus on helping all Black mothers regardless of income status?
Yeah, I think that that's something that hasn't really been touched on. Most times when you talk about Black women, there's an assumption that all Black women are poor. And although we're very much overrepresented in the poverty levels, there are Black women who are doing well financially, who have some degree of wealth, and who have higher education. So in 2013, 2014, I believe about 8,000 Black women received PhDs or professional doctorates, so it became MDs or JDs. So it's not that we're talking about one or two women that you're talking about dealing with. These are a lot of women who really need help. And so in the past, it was just assumed because in the general population, education is associated with positive birth outcomes, but for Black women, it's different. So I think that what this study is really pushing is that you can't look at the general population's protective factors and risk factors and apply those to Black women. And you really have to look deeper. So I'm hoping that this will kick off more initiatives, because in the past, they focused on poverty.
Well, Keisha Bentley Edwards, thank you so much for your insight and your time.
I really appreciate you sharing this information. Thank you.
Okay, so that's one video. I want to show you the next one, and then I'd like us to have some discussion.
Several years ago, two physicians in Chicago set out to solve a mystery. Why do African American women have babies that are born too small at twice the rate of white American women? Richard David and James Collins are neonatologists, pediatricians who specialize in the care of infants who come into the world too early or dangerously underweight, and often both. Like virtually everyone in their field, they were troubled by the striking racial differences in rates of premature and low birth weight babies. What could account for the differences?
I originally thought that the disparity in premature delivery was really driven by socioeconomic differences between African Americans and whites. It's well known that African Americans have a lower collectively socioeconomic status than whites, are less likely to receive college education than whites. So I thought once you corrected for that, that the gap would go away.
But Collins and David discovered the gap didn't go away.
We were very surprised to find that the gap actually widened as education and socioeconomic status improved. And then began to look at it from a bigger perspective and broader perspective, and really started to realize, well, maybe it's something about lifelong minority status, which is the driving factor here.
There's something about growing up as a Black female in the United States that's not good for your childbearing health. I don't know how else to summarize it.
So the two neonatologists began to explore whether being a member of a particular minority group might affect pregnancy outcomes, and they came up with a controversial hypothesis. What's behind the low birth weight and premature birth for African American babies is the unequal treatment of African Americans in American society. In other words, racism is taking a heavy toll on African American children even before they leave their mother's wombs. It's an idea that's slowly gaining acceptance.
We're in the midst of a paradigm shift. 15 years ago, racism as a risk factor was almost never heard of in a scientific paper, whereas now it's much more a possibility.
The story of Kim Anderson, a successful Atlanta executive and lawyer, illustrates exactly what David and Collins are talking about. We know that a healthy lifestyle should lead to a healthy baby. Women who eat well, exercise, get prenatal care, avoid alcohol and drugs and cigarettes are more likely to have a good pregnancy. But one of the best predictors for a healthy pregnancy outcome is higher education.
This is a picture of me, May 1984, when I graduated from Columbia Law School. People think I'm living the American dream, a lawyer with 2 cars, 2.5 kids, the dog, the porch, a good husband, great family. I've always been lucky to have good health. Always ate well, exercised, never smoked.
So when we look at Kim Anderson, a well-paid lawyer in good health, we would expect her newborn to be a healthy, full-term baby. It didn't turn out that way. Back in 1990, when she was pregnant with her first child, Kim went into labor 2.5 months early.
I just wanted to know at least that if she was born alive, that at least we had a fighting chance. I heard her cry, thank God. But she was so small, I mean, you could like hold her in the palm of your hand.
Kim's baby, Danielle, weighed only 2 pounds, 13 ounces when she was born. She joined the ranks of almost 300,000 low birth weight infants born in the US that year. About 1 out of every 14 babies, all of them at a high risk of dying before their first birthday.
I remember getting home and being in the bathroom, I fell apart. You know, because it's like I didn't get to take my baby home, you know, everything just sort of falling apart.
Preterm and low birth weight are the leading reasons that the US claims the dubious distinction of having one of the worst infant survival rates in the industrialized world. We fall behind dozens of countries. Babies born in Slovenia, Cyprus, Malta, and Croatia stand a better chance of living to the age of 1 than a baby born here.
It's kind of like the canary in the mine. It's the most sensitive of our health outcome indicators per population.
And infant mortality is not just a problem for African Americans.
White Americans, if they were a separate country, would still rank 23rd in the world. So outcomes are very bad.
Actually, I'm going to stop the share for a moment so we can have the gallery view. And if you can, share any thoughts that you might have about this.
I found it really shocking that as education went up for Black women, that their infant mortality went way up as well. I feel like I'm still a little confused about that, like the reasoning behind it.
I kind of feel the same also. I feel kind of like they left out a lot of information. Like we needed more information just in general about why the mortality rates are so high, even after being educated. I know that racism has a lot to do with it also, maybe just discrimination, not wanting to go to the doctor to get checkups because you feel like you're going to be judged even before you have the baby. Maybe they're young. So I feel like that is a huge thing, but it didn't really say, like, for the last video, like, why her baby ended up premature even after she ate well. She was very educated. She seemed like that she didn't have any problems with going to the doctor. So I don't know. I just feel like there was a lot left out.
Yeah, my takeaway from that was that they, and they stated this in the video, that their hypothesis for the reason why this was happening was because of racism, but they didn't actually give any proof, as they didn't back it up with any evidence or research that they had done. They just kind of presented that this was their hypothesis. And I would have loved to hear a little bit more about the research that they had done on that.
Well, I think they said that because, I mean, how do you prove? I mean, it's hard enough to prove stress in people, right? So how do you prove lifelong stress in something that people have always experienced? I mean, you know, you come out of the womb a different color and you encounter racism, you don't know any difference. So you don't necessarily register that as stress because it's your normal life.
I agree 100%, 100% on that.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying anything one way or the other, but scientifically, when you have a hypothesis, it has to be there has to be a measurable outcome, right? So if they're gonna make that hypothesis, I'm really interested to see how they would measure that and how they would be able to, you know, draw a conclusion from their research.
Yeah, I agree too. Maybe it was like interview based. You know, they did like interviews on all African American women, various ages, you know, from younger to, you know, mid-30s or whatever. And maybe that's how they got their information, but they didn't state that. So yeah, they should have definitely did a better job with that.
I assumed that they came to that conclusion because they were trying to look at across the board what is the differences in these, and then the fact that there was that racism that they live with every day. They're saying this is the only difference that we have, so this would lead us to believe this is the cause. But you're right, like you're saying, you want to know how they're going to come to the conclusion for the hypothesis. I don't know, and maybe that's why it's still just a hypothesis.
So
yeah, oh, sorry.
No. Okay, so it's interesting because science is messy. You guys know this, right? If it wasn't messy, we almost wouldn't have to study nutrition. We could just go, you know, you need to eat 5 carrots a day, and you do this and you do this and that, and you'll all live the same period of time, right? So we have, it's messy on figuring things out. And something like this, poverty, education, race, those are examples of variables that differ between people. What they have shown is all these other variables are not associated with the infant mortality rate, just the one, okay, which is being a Black female in the United States. Now, here's the deal, which may be of interest to you. If you look at other countries like Great Britain, there's a difference in the infant mortality rate. Doesn't mimic what's going on in the United States. Okay, so that's why they can say something like being African American or Black female in the United States is a risk factor compared to people of other race ethnicities and compared to African American people of African or African descent in other countries. So, and also there's more information than this. I wanted you to see, which I thought was kind of compelling. I wanted you to see that, but we have some understanding of what's going on a molecular level with stress. So you're right, it's difficult to prove stress, but what we can do, and I don't know that have any of y'all talked about epigenetics yet in your classes? Yes, some of you have. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this when I get to pregnancy, and this will help. We're going to pull this thread through as we get to pregnancy, because there's also a much higher maternal mortality rate in the United States if you're Black versus white. But what I want to say now is we do have a mechanism to explain this, which is epigenetics. You know what genes are, right? You're born with your genes, right? You have 2 alleles for all these traits. You've had all that background. epigenetics has to do with what genes are turned on and turned off that affect how you are, okay, in your health. And so epigenetics is a way to, like, if you have two twins, identical twins, and they go separate ways in life, they express different genes because of their life experiences. So life experiences, diet, stress, physical activity can change what genes are turned on and turned off, which is very interesting. So it gives a molecular explanation for stress and how it can affect things like premature delivery. Okay, and what causes maternal mortality? Hemorrhaging. Okay, so hemorrhaging is one of the biggest problems. And so what causes that? Well, looking at the epigenetics about people's propensity to have those difficulties. So I understand many hypotheses aren't provable. However, we know that racism is strong in the United States. It is a fact, right? I understand that people sometimes want to deny this, but it's this systematic racism has been demonstrated in many fields over and over and over again. All you have to do, and I'm not going to get in a debate about this, but all you have to do is look at what's happened with the recent riots. You look at Black Lives Matter riots, and then you look at the storming of the Capitol. Okay, and imagine if the people that stormed the Capitol were all Black, and what would have happened to in terms of the type of force that was used. I mean, I think we can all do that because we've seen that experiment going on this last year, right? So we've seen that. So that's just one example. So the world is not an even playing field for people, and there's what this discussion I hope fosters in you is a desire to support equality and equity and to fight for people. You in an environment where you are working with individuals, perhaps of other different races, you can make a difference. You can provide resources. You can help. You can work with other people. We can increase the diversity in the healthcare industries and in the approach that people get. But it's not just about healthcare. It's lifelong stress. The example that she gave in the discussion was if you're the first Black female in a medical school class, that's different than if there's 300 white males. They don't have the same stress as being a different from everybody else in an organization. So anyway, any more comments about this? I don't need to keep continuing about it, but I have more resources for you that are on the page if you want to dig around. There's some pretty good ones that go into a little more detail.
I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but it made me think when you mentioned genetics. In this previous class, we spoke about sickle cells and how African American people develop that because it's just, in their genetics, because in Africa, malaria is really, it's a problem. And so they've developed sickle cells, right? So even if you're born in America, you're more than likely to have sickle cells, right? Even if you weren't born in Africa, or just like after generations and generations, you develop that. So, I mean, but I don't know if it could be something with genetics in this.
I understand what you're saying. We do all have, different genes do pool in different groups, right? So there is some, of course, Black females or Black individuals are more likely to have sickle cell anemia. That's true. That is not an explanation for this phenomenon, but the expression of genes, which is what proteins do you make, what enzymes do you make, how good are you at blood clotting, for example, how good does your uterus start contracting too early in your pregnancy? Why would that? What are the forces that cause that to happen, which can have to do with stress? Our best of our understanding is your environment determines how successful you're going to be at maintaining that pregnancy. And the environment is a very, very complicated thing. I don't mean to sound one-sided here, because the world is very complicated, but we know that it's not an even playing field and hasn't been for decades. Anybody else?
I just think it's interesting how there's such a big difference between non-Hispanic blacks and I guess Afro Latinos and Latinas. It's just it's just crazy how what a big difference how the mortality rate almost doubled, in some studies, and how like compared to other countries, either white or black women, we have higher infant mortality rates here than in other countries, and we always assume the U.S. is such an advanced, we're so advanced medically and whatnot.
That's such a good comment. Our healthcare is a can of worms, right? If you have money and a good paying job right now, you can have access to healthcare, right? If you've historically been in families that have had insurance, then you may have had healthcare from the time you're born. Right now, we've talked about Texas. We have the lowest access to healthcare in the nation. So there's disparities across the states as well. And that's determined by the people in charge, right? The people in charge of Texas, when the Affordable Health Care initiative came out several years ago, said, no, we don't want the people in our state to have access to this, and we're not going to accept a bunch of federal dollars to do it. Some states do, some states don't, but all of these policies end up affecting people's health. And but it's complicated. I don't mean to be simplistic about this, but what we're talking about here is factual. There is, in fact, a very big difference in infant mortality rate. Thank you for that comment. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share the presentation if I can find it. Yeah, so here we are. Last time, can y'all see it now? Am I sharing the right thing? Can you see my slideshow?
Yes. Yes, I can see it.
Okay, so we talked about health equity, and we talked about how the difference here is we need to meet different people's needs. And so in this case, the example of infant mortality and also maternal mortality, not everybody needs the same treatment, right? So we need to figure out how to best help people with these high infant mortality and maternal mortality rates. What different care needs to be in place? This is a hot topic of research, but we're not remotely there right now. We're right in the middle of this. Okay, so that's the end of that discussion. But I will bring back that thread back through when we talk about pregnancy. Okay, so here's a term that's important to understand in infant nutrition called failure to thrive. And this is something that you may come across as a practitioner or as someone working with families. It's not in a clinical setting, but you may encounter it. So what is this? FTT is the acronym, and it's failure to thrive. If you are taking the exam, you need to know what this stands for. And so this is a condition diagnosed in kids under age 3. And there are some criteria. And I mainly want you to understand that the kids are small. Okay, so I won't say name these 3 things, but weight for length is less than 80% of ideal weight. Weight for age drops. And weight persistently low. Okay, so what, instead of having to know these numbers, I want you to understand that their weight for age goes down. So especially number 2 is important. And that they stay small. Weight persistently stays small. So these are important for you to understand. So what's the healthy thing is kids always grow. From the moment they're born, they lose weight for a couple of weeks because they're waterlogged, they're learning how to feed. There's that normal thing that happens for 2 weeks. And then by that time, they ideally between 2 and 3 weeks, they've regained their birth weight. And then from that moment on, they should grow incrementally until they're adults. Now, sometimes the growth rate's small and sometimes it's real big. We'll talk about this with adolescents, right? A 10-year-old boy may be, 5 feet tall, and when he's 12, he may be 6 feet tall, right? So there's a period of growth that just happens really fast in some people, or maybe 14 is more realistic with that. But so there's times where growth seems very slow and then where it speeds up. But growth should always happen. The kids should not plateau, and they certainly shouldn't get smaller. Okay, so, and also if it's severe, then they may have a reduced head circumference as well. So here's what a growth chart looks like for somebody with failure to thrive. So look in particular the weight, okay, weight for age, and notice how where they are on the percentile lines and how this kid's flattening out here and staying below. So he went from a high number to much lower. So that's what failure to thrive looks like on a growth chart. What causes this? Well, this is a no-brainer for all of us. You would automatically say, they're not eating enough to support growth. So they're not getting enough calories. And why? Maybe they have poor strength. Some infants have a poor suck, and you know, kids with Down syndrome, for example, have trouble sucking, and so the feeding is going to be different. Some kids have trouble eating; they have trouble with mouth control later, and some kids have low appetite, and this is difficult to get around because you really can't force somebody to eat. So they may not eat enough, but also they may have malabsorption. So there's something medical with absorption, not absorbing their calories. And they could have increased calorie expenditure and just need a lot more calories than somebody else. So chronic lung disease is an example of that. So the causes, intake does not meet the needs for growth. So what factors can be influenced here? Well, some are diet. You know, we talked about breastfeeding and breastfeeding difficulties. In a perfect world, we have access to healthcare, to lactation consultants and so forth. We all know that's not true right now, that many people don't have this type of help. If they continue to try to breastfeed without having the baby weighed, then it's possible that they're not producing enough milk and the baby doesn't thrive. So this is why we need to go back after 2 weeks, see if the weight gain is there, and then continue to weigh babies. That's why the pediatricians get involved. Let's weigh them, because this weight helps you figure out how they're doing. Sometimes people may prepare formula incorrectly. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is just not understanding how to do it. Another one is trying to make it last longer. So if you're strapped for money and you use formula and you don't use as much as required, like use half a scoop instead of a scoop, then the infant's going to get full from the volume of the water and formula, but not get adequate calories. And then some kids have trouble going from the whole liquid diet to food. And then another problem is, and this is where you want to get away from this sugar thing. A lot of parents are concerned sometimes when my kid's not eating, I'm going to give them sweet fatty stuff. I know they'll eat that. So then they can go with kids and go, here, have some ice cream. Don't eat, don't worry about your meal. You can have this. Well, let's give you juice. Let's give you this. And what happens is this sets up this sweet tooth, and they may develop this juice habit, but not consume calories, protein, carbohydrate, and fats that are needed to provide for growth. So and then they may be avoiding high calorie foods, and parents may be just not knowing any better. This is why parent education is really important, because parents may think, well, I have to watch what I eat, so let me watch the nutrient intake of my child. But that's not the way to do it, and we'll talk about this. We'll talk about the appropriate ways to feed kids so that we don't put those pressures we feel on them. Family, there can be a variety of social issues, and this is when you bring in social workers. Family, you're there for knowledge and education, and this is such a great need. Educating parents prenatally and then through the first 2 years of life is just an incredible need. There can be mental health issues and chaos where feeding is not really prioritized or taken care of. Then there can also be health issues, medical issues. So these are varieties of categories of issues. And so on an exam, I would ask you for these 3 categories. This is one of these, your study guides say these things, just so you know. I'm just trying to reinforce that. And then an example in a couple of cases so that you have an understanding of this. So what do we do? Well, what do doctors do? Well, nutritionists can observe feeding. They can observe bottle feeding, spoon feeding, self-child feeding, and assess a dietary intake. So this is in our wheelhouse. And we'll talk more about appropriate methods for doing this, but this is in our wheelhouse. And so if you watch this, you can see if parents are force feeding or not giving enough food, and there's things that you can look for that might be contributory. Or not, there's something called responsive parenting, where you look in the eyes of the infant and you are responsive to their needs. And if they turn their face away, you don't force feed them. And if they act hungry, you keep feeding them. And so parents can be trained on how to do this appropriately that might be beneficial. And then there can be some tests that can be medical issues, as we mentioned, iron deficiency, lead poisoning, and UTIs. These are common among kids. I mean, lead poisoning, if you've kept up with the news in the past 10 years, Flint, Michigan, the water supply there, because of bad decisions, the water supply there was heavily burdened with lead. And so a whole generation of kids fed that water developed lead poisoning, which has a permanent effect on IQ and growth. So these are things to look at. UTIs are interesting. Sometimes kids just are unhappy and cranky and don't feel good, and you can't really figure it out. And this is where a health care provider can help. They can do a test of your urinary tract infection. If that's the case, then antibiotics are very helpful for that. So those are some causes. Now, what do we do? Well, this kind of stems from what we talk about, the nutrition education, work with feeding, provide guidance, and look at any of these underlying causes. If it's iron deficiency anemia, then you want to fix that. If it's caused by lead, all you can do is remove the source of lead. There's not really good treatment past that. Anyway, almost everyone improves if there's intervention. Many improve as they grow and learn. Some kids kind of get out of this anxiety and some stay with it. Some people are perpetually not big eaters. And, you know, there's meeting your need for growth and brain development and so forth is critical, but not everybody needs to eat the same amount of food. So long-term effects are serious. It's the poor cognition, which can be due to iron deficiency, low calorie intake, and also if they have the lead issues. Okay, any questions right now about failure to thrive? Okay, well, what you would do if you're a dietitian, nutritionist in a situation like this is you'd bring in you'd bring in a social worker. And if you're in let's say you're a school nurse or you're in any kind of role working with kids, you flag problems that kids have and help make sure that the family have the resources they need, because parents may not even know what's going on sometimes. The world's been pretty overwhelmed for a lot of reasons in the past year, right, with COVID and family and deaths and so forth. So there may be people that aren't paying the attention that they need to do because they don't have the resources to do it. Life is a little bit hard right now. So how do we figure out what kids need? Okay, so what we do, because we can't do experiments on infants because it's unethical, but what we do is we figure out what is the energy requirements and nutrient needs based on average intake of breastfed babies, because that's our best scenario, right? Whatever's in breast milk, we figure that's going to be appropriate intake for kids. So there's some numbers here. From time to time in this class, I do have numbers. And I do this because somebody needs to know this, and practicing nutritionists need to know some basic information. If you are to become a pediatric dietitian, these would be numbers that are in your head, but also numbers in your little calculator when you do your calculations. But you need to understand the baseline. You need some of this in your head so that you can think with it. And so this is part of the purpose of learning some numbers. So an infant 0 to 6 months, they need 108 calories per kilogram per day, 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram, 31 grams of fat. Now, don't ask me why they said 31 instead of 30. It has to do with that average number. Okay. And then 500 milligrams of omega-3 fats. We'll get back at this. This is going to be a theme when we pull through this as well. Water, 1.5 milligrams per calorie. Vitamin D, iron, and fluoride. Here's what I want you to know. Energy. You can put little stars or write it down. Protein, fat, vitamin D, and iron. We'll talk about these more. Well, remember we talked about vitamin D already. Remember that they need that 400 IUs per day for the first year of life if they're breastfed. It's in formula if they're formula fed, so they don't need supplements, but we've already talked about this. We're going to focus on iron when we talk about children, because iron deficiency anemia is so serious. So look at this. This is 0 to 6 months, and just keep this number in your head. And as we progress through the older kids, you'll see how this iron requirement changes drastically. It becomes a bigger issue. All right, so here we go. If you go back we had 108 calories per kilogram. Now you move forward with the older kids, 6 to 12 months, it's fewer calories per kilogram. As you get bigger, you don't need as much calories per weight, and this keeps happening. Here's protein. What I like is to take a look at this. 13 grams per day, 13.5 grams per day. This is not much protein. Many parents provide way more protein than this. Let's say you're enamored with Greek yogurt and you give your kids Greek yogurt and then you give them eggs and then you give them meat and so forth. Their protein intake can be really high, and excess protein can be associated with excess body weight. So we have in the United States, adults, a lot of adults are into keto diets and so forth, and I don't eat carbs, I only eat a lot of protein. I think that'll help me with my weight and with my strength, and they may extrapolate that to kids. It's completely inappropriate. These guys don't need high levels of protein. They don't need to put on too much body mass too fast. They're growing a brain. They're learning how to eat food. Okay, so it's just a different thing. They're not adults. Same with the fat. And what I wanted to point out here, vitamin D stays the same. Look at the iron. So go back. For 0 to 6 months, the iron is 0.27 milligrams per day. If you move forward, it is 11 milligrams per day starting at 6 months. That's crazy difference, right? Now, what happens, we talked about it briefly, is that infants are born with pretty good iron stores that last. If it's a full-term pregnancy, okay, full-term pregnancy, the iron stores, sorry, let me go back. A lot of iron is not needed. Enough is provided by breast milk till about 4 to 6 months if they're born with good stores. But at around 6 months, all of a sudden, their needs for iron go up because they need to be putting on more tissue and they're out of excess storage, so that they have some in the bank and they've been using it up for making red blood cells and developing and growing tissues. Now they need more per day. So this becomes one of the biggest issues in feeding infants and toddlers, young infants, is making sure they get enough iron. You want to keep the vitamin D up. You want to make sure the iron, we provide good sources of iron, and we moderate our protein intake. And we make sure they get essential fats. Okay, so I'm going to call this a good time to stop the discussion. We've had several things that we've talked about today. So we'll begin next time talking about iron. Are there any questions?